Hi everyone, this is your video topic analysis for the November 2015 Public Forum topic. Resolved. In response to the current crisis, a government should prioritize the humanitarian needs of its refugees over its national interests. As a quick roadmap, I'm going to be going over framing the round, some background, pro-arguments, con-arguments, and then general takeaways from debating in November. Let's start with framing the round. Prioritize has two generally accepted definitions: deciding things based on importance, and also deciding things based on the order that they should be dealt with. I think both definitions can lend themselves to both sides. On the idea that prioritize is about importance, it's pretty intuitive for Kant to say that a government should be prioritizing its national interests. But by the same token, the magnitude of human suffering brought on by the refugee crisis makes just as valid a case on pro. On the definition that prioritize is what we do first, Kant could say that we need to address our national interests before we start looking to the needs of others, a sort of prereq argument, which pro could answer by saying that life and death matters always take precedence. Whatever route you take, I think it's crucial that debaters on both sides remember that when you prioritize one thing, you can still do the other. In other words, you only have to slightly tip the scale to your side to win. The pro doesn't completely neglect our national interests, and the con doesn't have to completely neglect the humanitarian needs of the refugees. With that said, I think it's worth talking about the general question posed by the resolution. Pro teams need to be prioritizing the humanitarian needs of refugees, and con teams need to be prioritizing national interests. At first glance, this actually feels a little weird to me, because it seems as though definitionally everything a government does is for its national interests. Teams might find themselves running, helping refugees actually helps the economy, or it alleviates national security concerns. And then it becomes unclear which side this argument falls under. Are we prioritizing the refugees, with some external benefits to our national interests? Or are we prioritizing our national interests in such a way that entails helping the refugees? I think the most complex and interesting debates are going to center around this question. There's interesting philosophical background you could use to frame the round, and Michael Norden expands on this in his topic analysis. Cosmopolitanism is the idea that human beings belong to a global community, so there's no controversy around prioritizing outsiders versus insiders. The government should just help those who need it. Meanwhile, contractarianism is the idea that government is created through a contract with its citizens, so it should prioritize its citizens' interests. On a similar topic about government, my partner and I referenced Peter Singer, who has a useful analogy as to whether a moral agent should act. Basically, if there's a drowning baby and you could save it without yourself dying, then you have a moral obligation to do so, even if it means, obviously, damaging your clothes. Peter Singer argues, quote, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything else morally significant, we ought morally to do it. On a final note here, if you're going to be making arguments about the government acting according to morals, you need to be prepared to have the debate about whether governments are moral agents in the first place. This brings me to the use of the term a government. In debate, it's not uncommon to hear that you should look to the round from the perspective of the actor in the resolution, that is, the entity that's actually doing something. According to this view, you could argue that we should prefer impacts to the government. On the other hand, you could probably outweigh the impacts to the refugees as being a much greater concern, or argue that governments exist to serve people, so we should look to people. Finally, I've already heard a buzz that teams are going to pick specific advocacies like food aid, or specific governments like Germany to debate the resolution. After all, it does say a government, which you could interpret to be just one government. However, it's probably truer to the resolution to debate the more abstract big picture of what a government should do in general. These framing considerations are a lot to think about. But before we move on, we should establish what exactly is the current crisis. There are a couple of routes here. One, as I mentioned earlier, is to suggest that it doesn't matter. This debate is about the theoretical question of what a government, any government, should do in the face of a big refugee crisis. This interpretation will lead to the same, if not better, discussions of the economy, national security, humanitarian suffering as any other, so it's certainly valid. Another is to be squirrely, and choose a very specific refugee crisis. Don't get me wrong, teams will get away with things like this. But a good opponent will quickly dismiss that this isn't the refugee crisis the framers of the resolution intended that we talk about. A third route that's on the unique side, but may have an interesting argument backing it up, is to argue that the current refugee crisis is that provoked by climate change. The Environmental Justice Foundation reports that global warming will force up to 150 million climate refugees in the next 40 years, which makes for a huge crisis, albeit not necessarily a current one. That's up to debate. That said, many experts think that current issues like the droughts in Syria have been a contributing factor to violence in the region. This brings me to a final, more commonly accepted interpretation, that this is the Syrian refugee crisis. The World Bank lists Syria, followed by Afghanistan and Somalia, as the top countries of origin for refugees. But these are only a few of over 15 conflict regions, making for around 20 million refugees, which lots of sources agree is the worst migrant crisis since World War II. So how does this interact with national interests? The BBC reports that tensions in the EU have been rising because of the disproportionate burden faced by some countries, particularly Greece, Italy, and Hungary, where migrants have been arriving by boat and overland. Different countries have dealt with it in different ways. Germany has accepted over 200,000 applications for asylum. Meanwhile, in the UK, over 60% of applications for asylum are initially refused. And Hungary, which was facing the largest influx of refugees per capita, has recently taken up a much harsher stance against refugees. The reasons range from concerns about the country's limited resources to straight-up xenophobic arguments. The next question, then, is about the humanitarian issue. This year, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 refugees have passed away on the Mediterranean. In April, a boat carrying 800 migrants capsized off of Libya due to overcrowding. And for those that make it, the road ahead is still extremely harsh, sometimes being made even worse by the European countries that are detaining migrants for periods of 90 days or more. The resolution asks about humanitarian needs. So without getting into the specifics, it's pretty clear that these are basic needs like shelter, food, and water. Let's dive into pro-arguments. The Global Humanitarian Assistance Initiative explains that humanitarian aid is designed to save lives, alleviate suffering, and maintain and protect human dignity. Since the humanitarian needs are so basic, shelter, food, water, etc., and the benefits so huge, literally life and death in some cases, then pro has a very compelling case. I've seen plenty of rounds come down to, weigh lives above all else, we save the most lives. Of course, the resolution also prompts bigger questions about the role of government, and pro can make arguments from a moral perspective. I've already mentioned cosmopolitanism, which you could use to argue that a government shouldn't arbitrarily prefer its own citizens over others. There's also the idea of birth lotteries. We are born into a specific country by chance, and when we turn away refugees, that birth lottery is determining our fate. Additionally, you can make Peter Singer's argument, that we have a moral obligation to save a drowning baby unless it comes at a risk to our own lives. Here, Khan would have to either reject the moral idea, or prove that prioritizing the refugees does come at a cost so significant to these governments that it does constitute a sort of existential risk. So I've touched on two main lines of argumentation for pro. One, the humanitarian benefit, and two, the moral argument. There's also the gray area I keep hinting to, where the humanitarian needs of refugees and the national interests of a government overlap. In fact, you could even make the case that addressing the humanitarian needs of refugees is a prerequisite to further concerns down the road about the government's national interests. For instance, perhaps prioritizing their humanitarian needs bolsters the government's international credibility. Or it's good for national security, since it reduces the risk of violence stemming from a large migrant population. Or it's good for the economy if these people enter the workforce in places where they're needed. But again, in order for this to be a pro-argument, you need to prove that it's happening as a prioritization of their humanitarian needs, not the other way around. So what about con? A main argument on con is that refugees drain resources. A paper from the Center of Migration, Policy, and Society reports, from the moment of arrival, refugees compete with the local citizens for scarce resources such as land, water, housing, food, and medical services. Over time, their presence leads to more substantial demands on natural resources, education, health facilities, energy, transportation, social services, and employment. At the same time, lots of European countries have a low birth rate and an aging population, creating a demographic problem. So accepting refugees might actually be a solution. Here's where the topic gets tricky. Is this an answer to the con argument, or is this another distinct con argument? After all, isn't a country's national interest to fix its economy by addressing a demographic shift? This will all come down to how you frame your case. Like on pro, there's good arguments as to root causes and long-term solutions. Remember that the refugee crisis is spilling out of conflict regions. At the UN, politicians have said, quote, "As long as there is conflict in Syria, the refugee crisis will not go away. The efforts of the entire international community should be focused on ending hostilities in conflict zones," end quote. If you can make the case that addressing conflict is in our national interests, then prioritizing national interests will solve for the root cause of the refugee crisis, and so in the long run, you prevent more of the conflict. A different argument that cuts from the same cloth is that if we just ameliorate the refugee crisis, we let the bad guys win, so to speak. Writing for Al Jazeera, Crispin Cass warns that we should appraise the unintended yet detrimental consequences for those left behind. Accepting those young, fit, and wealthy enough to flee not only ignores the plight of the elderly, sick, and poor, but exacerbates the original situation by removing those most capable of bringing peace and prosperity back to the region. This argument personally feels a little harsh, but it does speak to the idea that you can't put a band-aid on a bullet wound. Root cause and long-term arguments are compelling when it comes to weighing, because you come across as the problem solver, with more foresight and ultimately more impact. That said, remember that the resolution calls for prioritization. Pro teams should respond that if people are being persecuted and risking their lives every day, engaging in a military conflict to solve the root cause, or turning refugees away on the hopes that they'll go home to brave the conflict, might not be exactly what we need to be prioritizing. Another important word in the resolution, that I touched on in discussing framework, is government. Con teams could argue that governments are the wrong actor, maybe because, among other reasons, they are bound by a social contract with their citizens. Another concern that the media has addressed, and perhaps exaggerated, is the security risk posed by accepting refugees. Remember that these are conflict zones. Terrorist groups have claimed that they are taking advantage of the migrant situation to infiltrate operatives to carry out attacks. There's literature out there that more refugees does lead to more terrorism, although Pro can turn this and say that this is exactly why we need to prioritize the refugee crisis. An important note here, though. There's a difference between prioritizing the crisis as a whole, which could include dealing with terrorism concerns, and prioritizing the humanitarian needs of refugees, a more specific aspect of the crisis. Also keep in mind that a lot of these arguments are driven by xenophobia and more specifically Islamophobia. These arguments are valid only to the extent that the backlash from citizens of receiving countries will make it impossible to successfully help refugees. But it's also a bad idea to run arguments or cards that are substantiated with fundamentally xenophobic arguments. No matter what side you're on, being sensitive to the way you discuss the topic. In a really interesting essay called Empathy and Extemp, former extemper Dylan Edelman writes that we analyze the world from the perspective of power, hegemony, and numbers, and too often ignore the human implications. This makes us lack empathy, compassion, and for as much research as we've packed into our block files, we fail to truly understand our arguments. So be sensitive when you discuss the topic, because your debates do have the potential to educate. I hope this gives you some ideas for upcoming tournaments, and I definitely encourage you to check out the brief for specific cards. On that note, some general takeaways about debating in November. The tournaments I have been to are Blue Key at the University of Florida, Titan at Nova High School, and the Glenbrooks in Chicago. Blue Key largely attracts debaters from the South, while Titan is more localized to South Florida. You'll find a mix of judges at each tournament, probably with more college students at Blue Key. Explain your arguments persuasively, understand your warrants, meaning the reason why your argument is true, and terminalize your impacts, meaning don't just say, for example, the impact is decreased international credibility, but actually ground the weighable implications of that. And you should have really great rounds. Above all, remember to have fun. That's why you're debating in the first place.